I'm gonna talk through McKinney Vento Homeless Assistance Act 101. I do want to say if you have questions throughout, please put those in the chat. We'll try to get to them at the end. Um, we may answer that question while I'm talking through everything, but definitely put questions into the chat as you're thinking of them. That's definitely okay. And then we will get to them, and at the end you can raise your hand and unmute and all of that as well. So really overview of McKinney Vento. I really like to lay the framework and talk about what students like the kind of landscape of students experiencing homelessness in our Wisconsin schools before I get into what the law says and why we're doing it, because this is ultimately the why. These are the students that we're supporting, and this is why the McKinney-Vento Homeless Assistance Act is so important for our students. So some causes of homelessness. One thing I'm hearing, and I know is the case across every part of Wisconsin, is that affordable housing is very, very difficult to find for families. So there's a huge lack of affordable housing across the state. Just poverty in general. As poverty increases, we also see an increase in homelessness. Health problems can cause homelessness for families as well. There's a lack of health insurance. There might be some AODA issues happening or mental health going on for the family. Domestic violence, natural and other disasters. I am very thankful that we haven't had any hurricanes here in Wisconsin, but I know my counterparts in other states right now are dealing with a lot of homelessness due to disasters. And then abuse, neglect, and family dysfunction, in particular for our unaccompanied youth. And we'll talk more about that today as well. So really wanted to share some data, again, kind of paint the picture of what homelessness looks like in our Wisconsin schools. So this is homeless student enrollment data for the last few years. The dip down, I don't know if the numbers are cut off on the screen, so sorry if they are, but the dip down is the 2020-21 school year. So the COVID year, not all schools were in person. We had a really big decrease in numbers because it was really difficult to identify families when students weren't present in front of us. So that's a national trend, but that's why there's that big dip. And then we've been steadily increasing every year since then. The 2023-24 school year, last year, we saw a really big increase in our identified students. We think that's due to better identification strategies in districts and also an increase in homelessness overall in the state. So we are now above pre-pandemic numbers. The 23-24 school year numbers are not certified yet, so they may change a little bit. In the past, we haven't seen certified data change drastically, so we are really looking at that, about a 1,500 student increase from the prior year. We at DPI had a big data dive done this summer, so we have the report from that now. Really specifically looking at our homeless data, our homeless student data, looked at outcomes, looked at various factors for our students experiencing homelessness. And I just want to highlight a few things from that because it puts it into kind of a more better picture of the reality of homelessness in our state. So when it was looked at students who have experienced homelessness in the past 5 years, the population of our students experiencing homelessness doubles. So from 22-23 school year and then the 5 years prior, and a student experienced homelessness, even if it is one time in those 5 years, it increased to over 40,500 students were homeless at least once in that time frame. So we typically have around 2% of our total student population in Wisconsin experiencing homelessness in any given year, but that increases to nearly 5% who have experienced homelessness within a 5-year period. So when we're thinking about our students experiencing homelessness, it really is a bigger perspective than we're looking at when we think of just 1 year of our data. Or maybe you're getting a student into your district who experienced homelessness a couple years ago, but that might still be impacting them. Also, just to kind of paint a picture for you all as well, in the 22-23 school year, of the top 10 districts with the highest percentage of students experiencing homelessness, 7 were rural districts with less than 1,000 total students in their district. So really just wanted to paint that picture that a lot of times we think about our urban areas having a lot of homelessness. And while they do have large numbers, when we look at percentages, our rural districts are really up there as well. So homelessness is all across the state. And when our consultant was diving into that data, districts with really small numbers were removed from that data set because one student would drastically change their percentage. So just sharing that it's not just our urban districts, it's our rural districts as well, with really high percentages of students experiencing homelessness. And then when we look at outcome data, this is just one really small snippet of a lot of the data that we have, but just wanted to be able to show at least one outcome for you all. This graph is showing ELA proficiency trends, comparing homeless students with non-homeless students. So our homeless students are the teal bar, and then our non-homeless students are the kind of pinkish salmon bar on here. It's the 6th, 7th, and 8th grade over a few years. We took out the data, or there wasn't data from the pandemic year available because we didn't do testing that year. But really what we're looking at is the bouncing back academically from the pandemic hasn't happened yet for our students experiencing homelessness. So you can see those upticks in the 22-23 school year for our housed students. That hasn't happened yet for our students experiencing homelessness. And then one more, just kind of outcome data, we're looking at graduation rates. For our students experiencing homelessness, we're comparing just everybody, the total cohort graduation rate. The middle graph is ever free and reduced price lunch in high school. So again, not looking at just 1 year, we're looking at a cohort of students across their high school career. So ever free and reduced price lunch, and then ever homeless in high school. So a lot of times I think as districts and as a state as well, when we look at data, we don't really look at our homeless data outside of low income students. And we really need to be, because the numbers are very different for looking specifically at our students experiencing homelessness. So when we're looking at graduation rates, as a state in general, Wisconsin has a really high graduation rate. About 92.4% of our students graduate on time. But then when we're looking at our students experiencing homelessness, it drops to 67.7% of our students graduate on time. And you can see it increases, graduation rates increase when we look at those 5-year and 6-year graduation cohorts. But overall, it's a very low graduation rate for our students experiencing homelessness as well. And I see someone asked about if the report was available, and it's not yet available. At DPI, we're still looking into what it means and what we want to be doing to develop some resources, as Clara said. All right, so now we're going to get into the McKinney-Vento Homeless Assistance Act. Just really wanted to start with that picture of what homelessness is looking like in Wisconsin. The McKinney-Vento Homeless Assistance Act was originally passed in 1987. It was most recently updated in 2015 as part of the Every Student Succeeds Act, and there were some updates that were made in 2015. It really works hand in hand with other federal laws, IDA, Title I, other federal education programs. It applies to all public school districts and independent charter schools. And really, ultimately, it's ensuring that all children and youth that are experiencing homelessness are identified, enrolled, and are able to have that success in school. McKinney-Vento has a definition of homeless. It may be a little bit different than other definitions of homeless that are out there, or maybe just what we assume homelessness looks like. Um, and it's children who lack a fixed, regular, and adequate nighttime residence. So, what does that mean? What is fixed, regular, and adequate? Fixed means it's stationary, it's not subject to change for the student. Regular is that it can be used on a predictable, consistent basis. And adequate is that it's lawfully and reasonably sufficient. So it's where a person would typically be living, and then it's sufficient for meeting the physical and psychological needs that are typically met in a home environment. A question you could ask, kind of think about in your mind is, can the student go to the same place every night to sleep in a safe and sufficient space? McKinney-Vento also states specific living situations as homeless in the law. Um, Sharing the housing of others due to a loss of housing, economic hardship, or a similar reason. This is commonly referred to as doubled up. This is the living situation that about 75% of our students in Wisconsin are living in when they're identified as experiencing homelessness. We will be talking deeper about eligibility later today and get into that a little bit more. Living in hotels, motels, trailer parks, campgrounds, those types of places due to lack of adequate alternative accommodations. I know we do see a lot of, in Wisconsin, we do see a lot of families camping until campgrounds close. Living in emergency or transitional shelters, living in public or private place, anywhere that's not ordinarily used as a place for sleeping. So families living in their cars, parks, places like that. And then notes that children from migratory families who live in any of those instances and qualify as homeless would be identified, and also unaccompanied homeless youth. So an unaccompanied youth living in any of these situations would also be identified. Our unaccompanied homeless youth, we're also going to talk more about unaccompanied homeless youth later today, but it's a child or youth without a fixed, regular, and adequate nighttime residence, so they meet that definition of homeless, and they're not in the physical custody of a parent or legal guardian. Just a couple examples are children and youth living with relatives on an emergency basis. It could be youth living with a friend, a youth who ran away from home. And we see in Wisconsin, there's kind of a trend for unaccompanied homeless youth of being young children who might be living with a family member or a family friend on an emergency basis, or older youth who are kicked out, have run away, living with a friend. That's just kind of the trend we see, but it can be a student of any age. Okay, so identification is critical to successful implementation of the McKinney-Vento Act and your program in your district. So children and youth experiencing homelessness need to be identified by school personnel through outreach and coordination with other agencies, entities, anyone in your community who might make a referral. Children and youth who are identified or must be informed of their rights under McKinney-Vento, so informing the parents, informing an unaccompanied youth on their own. Um, and just to know that liaisons may not investigate, but can ask questions to better understand living situations. You're going to have to ask questions because you're going to need to really be able to get the details to understand some of the living situations. A lot of times it's not very clear. It might not be a clear situation. So really asking those questions with discretion and with courtesy, but not investigating a living situation. Some more strategies for identification. I recently was at the WCAS conference and we talked about some of these things, which was interesting with the folks at my session of really avoid using the word homeless with school personnel, families, and with youth. It can be really, really stigmatizing for families to say, yes, I'm homeless, when they might not think of themselves as homeless, but they meet the definition under McKinney-Vento. It can be it can just be very stigmatizing. I know in smaller communities too, communities just take care of the folks that are there. Um, and having that defining characteristic might be impacting how they're talking, how families reach out to this school, or how they're working with other people. So consider using other language like family in transition, um, a family that doesn't have stable housing, just things other than that homeless word. Post outreach materials on posters in all school buildings and places that families frequent. It could be a campground in your community, health centers, just where families are going, so they can see that information. They know who to reach out to if they're experiencing homelessness. Really recommend using enrollment forms to inquire about living situations every year at enrollment. Having questions that talk about different living situations, not a question that says, are you homeless? Yes or no. Families aren't going to know what that means. They might, again, feel stigmatized. They probably don't know all of the scenarios that fall into the McKinney-Vento definition of homeless. So really be thinking about the language you're using with those enrollment forms as well. And then make special efforts to identify preschool children or younger children in the house by asking about younger siblings in the family if you do identify a student. And again, coordinating with those community service agencies to potentially get referrals if they know a family is experiencing homelessness or they suspect a family, to be getting those referrals back to the school district. We'll talk about some of these again in more detail later, but provide training activities for school staff. And when I say school staff, I mean all school staff. It could be bus drivers who are really having conversations with students on a daily basis, cafeteria workers, um, office staff who have families come in face to face and they're talking with them um, daily, and really have training activities and for those staff members so they know what McKinney-Vento is. They know the indicators of homelessness and what to kind of be looking for or hearing when they're talking to a family. And then ensure that staff know who to contact. So however that works in your district, who the homeless liaison is or who their contact is in the building. So they know who then to reach out to for that referral. And all of that comes together to really have a process for identification throughout the year. Having those enrollment forms is highly recommended, but then what happens if a student loses housing during the school year? How is the school finding out about that? Once a student is identified, children and youth have the right to either attend their school of origin or the local attendance area school where they're currently residing. And so the school of origin is the school the child or youth attended when they were last permanently housed, or the school in which the child or youth was last enrolled and attending. There is that or in there, so sometimes students have two schools of origin. That's not typical. Usually it's the school in which the child or youth was last enrolled and attending is their one school of origin. With school of origin, it includes a district administered preschool. So in Wisconsin, that really is going to look like 4K because we pretty much have universal 4K with all of our school districts here in the state. So a district administered preschool, but that does mean those community 4K sites where students are enrolled in the district as well. It also includes the designated receiving school at the next grade level for feeder pattern schools. So if a student is identified in middle school and they're transitioning to the high school starting from 8th grade to 9th grade, that next high school that they would go to in the feeder pattern is their school of origin. McKinney-Vento presumes that keeping the student in the school of origin is in the student's best interest. If the parent or the unaccompanied youth does not want to stay in the school of origin, then we would go with that request. But really it's presumed that it's in the best interest of the student to stay in the school of origin. And students have the right to remain in the school of origin for the whole time they're experiencing homelessness. And if they do obtain permanent housing during the school year, McKinney-Vento rights and services continue for that school year. So rights to school of origin continue for the rest of that year as well. Okay, so transportation, when a student is remaining in their school of origin, districts must provide transportation to and from the school of origin if it's a barrier for the student to participate in their education. Again, this also includes until the end of the year if the student obtains permanent housing. We know transportation is one of the biggest things school districts are working with because there's a lack of transportation, a lack of drivers, a lack of options potentially. Um, and we know it's really, really difficult, but that transportation um, is a right under McKinney-Vento. If the student is staying in the same district and they maybe are just attending a school building across town, that district needs to arrange transportation for the student. If the student is living in a different school district boundary, those two school districts need to work together to divide the responsibility and the cost of that transportation. An agreement can be made between the two school districts. Otherwise, the law states that the districts have to share the cost equally, so 50-50 split. And then if there are any transportation barriers to attending classes and participating fully in school, and participating fully does mean including extracurricular activities. So consider what activities your students experiencing homelessness are a part of, and ensuring that they're able to get there if they need transportation or get home later after school because there's a club happening after school, things like that. I see a chat came in and want to address it before we kind of keep going. So if a child enrolled but never attended, the enrolled school, is the enrolled school considered school of origin? If the student never attended there, that would not be their school of origin. Um, Really, ultimately, school of origin rights are there to maintain those relationships that the student has built with staff, with their peers, and we want to keep them in a stable environment. So if a student has not attended that school, um, that would not be their school of origin.
And Christine, just to back up what you're saying, if you look
Yeah.
at the McKinney-Vento Act's definition of enrolled, it says attending classes and participating fully in school activities. So along with the spirit of the law of McKinney-Vento of providing continuity of educational experience and relationships, we also have the actual statutory language that would say then if the child actually never attended or participated in school activities, that wouldn't meet the statutory definition of enrollment as well. So I wanted to point that out in case those of you are like this. We've got some policy folks on the line.
Thanks, Christina. All right, transportation strategies. So again, we know transportation is a challenge for districts across the state. But really develop close ties among other homeless liaison school staff, your pupil transportation staff, to really be able to smoothly transition or smoothly set up transportation when it's needed. Again, I can't stress this enough. Please contact the district where the student is residing to arrange that transportation. Um, I've been hearing it less and less, but sometimes districts reach out to me when they just receive a bill without warning from a district. So I always talk about this, but please, call that other homeless liaison, really get their input. They might have a more cost-effective way to provide transportation, or they might have a driver available, whatever it might be. So really discuss what your options are and then how that might be shared. Lots of different ways to provide transportation, school buses, public transportation if you have it, carpools, van, or taxi services. And probably the most common thing that we see is reimbursing parents or youth or a family friend or whoever the student is staying with for gas. So you can do that with gas cards. Most districts are use the fuel only gas cards from gas stations. And you can be looking at, did the student attend every day this week? We're going to reimburse for the days only that the student is here at school. So you can be looking at that attendance of when, how much to reimburse families. You could also do like a reimbursement through the district, like other staff are reimbursed, if that works. But I know those fuel only gas cards work pretty well for a lot of school districts. And then one thing to keep in mind is if you're looking at attendance and kind of giving a gas card after a week or after 2 weeks for the days that the student was in school, really be thinking about that initial identification, and can the parent get the student to school right away? They might need a gas card right away, and then kind of monitor attendance and adjust going forward from there. Just be mindful of some of the barriers that families might be facing with transportation. Develop agreements with neighboring school districts. If you have a district that you share a boundary with and you have a lot of students living back and forth that might be experiencing homelessness, you might be able to arrange something with that school district. I know of 2 school districts in the state who one buses the kids, wherever they're living, if that district buses to school, and where they're attending, that district buses home from school, then they're not sharing invoices and trying to bill each other. So there might be some strategies there with your neighboring school districts as well. And then look at interagency solutions. Is there a shelter in your community that has a van that maybe could transport kids? Is there a different program that exists, a Boys and Girls Club that has a van? Just be thinking about some of those other creative transportation strategies. Okay, I'm seeing a lot of questions come in now, so let's pause. I'm going to pause. If anyone wants to unmute, remember, raise your hand and we'll get you able to unmute. And I'm going to look in the chat for some questions here. So someone asked, does extracurricular activities include sports? Yes. Someone else had that question. Are internships included in transportation support? I might need some more information about that one. And then I think someone had folks have their hand raised.
Yep, for those of you who raised your hand, I did allow you to unmute yourself. So you do have to still, I think, click the unmute button.
Yep, so I will, M. Clements. I don't know what your first name is.
Malia.
Hi.
So, hi, thanks. This is actually, I'm so happy. This is super helpful. And I've already been taking notes of, you've answered a ton of the we aren't sure questions so far. When you talk about the transportation piece, that's obviously like, it's a law, it's legal, we have to provide transportation, but there's no funding for that. And so you're saying if I have a student who's moved a town or 2 over, well, not moved, but that's where they're finding their place to stay currently, it is equally that district and our district's responsibility to figure out the most cost-effective way to provide transportation?
Yes.
Okay, so that is great. So they could potentially be the person, if they have more resources than we do, they could potentially be the one providing the transportation, and then we reimburse them.
Yes. Yep. However, really it's that, again, really contacting that other district, talking about what options are available and how that cost is going to be shared, right?
Yes. And then I think do we have access to this whole slide after this, just as a reference? After today?
Yes, you actually do have access to this slide deck right now. If you go to our website, I can put the link in here if you would like. But yes, you will have access to the slides and the recordings after they're completed.
Okay, thank you. And then we had some just transition the past 3 years with superintendents and other people. And I used to be the person who provided like the resources with families and the communication with families. And now I am just straight up our homeless liaison, as well as our school counselor, as well as our mental health navigator, as well as I have a long list. And so my question is, I have been kind of trying to advocate for other people to at least have the understanding and education in McKinney Vento, how to identify what the process should be. So do other people, or is it suggested that there's sort of a team and I could be our homeless liaison, but that other people within buildings?
Yeah. Thanks for that question. I'm going to hold on that because we will be talking about that a lot today.
Oh, perfect. Okay.
Yep.
Awesome.
Yep. Thank you. Yeah. Okay. I know Elise had your hand raised as well.
I did, but I think in the chat now they're saying, because my finance person, or not, well, not mine, the school's finance person told me a school bus cannot enter another district to pick up a child. And I was like, then how do we ever transport kids who are identified as McKinney Vento? But in the chat, it sounds like it extends across state and district lines. So it's between the two LEAs to use discretion and decide.
Yeah, I think maybe what your person is talking about, if your district is contracting for busing, sometimes the contracts prohibit that crossing district lines. So that's something you'll have to look into, and that could be a barrier that is removed going forward. But that could be where the that's coming from. But yes, the law does state that it's crossing state lines, district lines, anything like that. So might be looking at your contracts.
Thank you.
Yeah. Yep, someone asked about state lines. Oh, okay. So the person with the internships question clarified it's internships that are off-site, part of a student's school day. So if there's something like that that's part of the student's education plan, that's what their school day is, then yes, transportation would need to be provided for that so they can participate in that activity that's part of their school day.
And then Ashley, if you want to, you are able to unmute yourself if you want to ask your question.
Okay, so I'm sorry, I can't get my camera to work. It came on when I first joined, but it does not want to work for me right now.
Okay.
So if a student, so we kind of are smack dab in the middle of two very close districts, and we had a family that was in transition, ended up obtaining permanent housing right away when they relocated. So would it be on our district's responsibility to provide transportation if the family chose to continue to attend our district until the end of the year? Or because they obtained permanent housing right away, they would have to make the decision to do the transportation or enroll elsewhere with the new district?
Thanks. I see your comment in the chat now about that too. So McKinney Vento rights and services continue for the remainder of a year if student obtains permanent housing. So in this case, the student would have the right to continue in your school as the school of origin for the rest of the year. Transportation would be provided, again, shared by both school districts. That's the right that the student has under McKinney Vento. We will, in just a minute, talk about best interest, and best interest may come into play in that situation.
Okay.
Sorry, that's vague for now, but I will talk about it on the next slide.
No, that makes sense. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay, Clara shared the link to the presentations that are posted already. And then Christina gave a really good recommendation in the chat that sometimes districts will meet at the district boundary. So if your bus can't cross district boundaries, one district could bus to that boundary, the other could pick up from that boundary and then continue the student on their way.
Yeah, we have
Okay.
one more question, and then I think that we're
Great.
going to move on. So yeah, Amy, you should be able to ask.
You're
But
muted still,
you're
Amy.
still muted. You still have to unmute.
Okay. You're still muted, Amy. Sorry. Give you a minute to try to figure out, or maybe just type it into the chat if you can do that. Okay, we will
Maybe
work on that.
her
I'm gonna,
microphone. I was gonna say maybe her microphone's grayed out. That's happened to me sometimes, maybe. I don't know.
Yep, I think if you can type it into the chat, we can try to figure that out later. We will have time for some more questions at the end of the presentation as well.
thanks, Clara. Okay, want to get into that determining best interest. That was a nice little segue that we had from someone else. Okay, I'll get to the Amy's question later. So again, McKinney-Vento presumes that keeping the student in their school of origin is in that student's best interest, unless it's contrary to the request of the parent, guardian, or unaccompanied youth that they want to enroll where they're residing. So when we're thinking about best interest, we really want to consider student-centered factors, including the impact of mobility on the achievement, the education, the health, and the safety of that student. So in that example that was talked about of a student, I don't know if that was this year or last year, let's say it's right now, this school year, that a student was identified as experiencing homeless at the beginning of the year. They now have permanent housing. It may be in that student's best interest to continue in the school of origin for the rest of this school year. If it's a senior in high school, I sure bet they want to stay in their school of origin and graduate with the students that they've been attending with for their whole high school career. That could be something that's considered when you're looking at best interest. It also could be considered that right now, today, it's the end of October. Is it in that student's best interest to stay in their school of origin, or does it make sense to make that transition for the rest of the school year? Maybe it's making the transition at a break in the quarter, or a break at semester, or if you have a fall break coming up, maybe after that. But really be thinking about those best interest factors of, what's going to be best for that student. If it's a district that's, an hour and a half away and a young student is going to be on a bus for an hour and a half in the morning, that might not be in that student's best interest when we think about the impact on that student's education, or their health and safety in that commute. So those are all things to be thinking about. It's really a case-by-case basis. That also goes for students, even if they haven't found permanent housing, but again, maybe that long commute really isn't in the best interest of a student to do that. Also, highly encouraged to just be talking with families about that. Talk to them about all of those factors. How is being, an hour away possibly going to impact that student's attendance, even if transportation is provided? Or what is that going to look like when it's winter and it's really cold? Or again, maybe they have a car and they can drive, and so there really isn't a barrier, and it's just providing that gas reimbursement for families. But really be thinking about those student-centered factors when talking about best interest for the family. And again, it's giving priority to the parent, guardian, or the unaccompanied youth themselves. Okay, if the parent, guardian, or unaccompanied youth disagrees with the district determination of best interest or enrollment or eligibility, Then you would follow your district's McKinney-Vento dispute process. So the part of that is that the district has to provide the parent, guardian, or unaccompanied homeless youth with a written explanation of the reasons for the determination. So again, really encouraging everyone to be talking with families, talking with youth, talking about it all before it would get to this point. But if there's really still a disagreement, then you would need to notify the family in writing of that decision. It needs to be in a form and a way that's understandable to the parent. So that might be in a different language. It just needs to be understandable to them. And it needs to include information on how they can appeal that decision and that they have the right to appeal that decision. Your district should have a McKinney-Vento dispute process as part of your district policies around McKinney-Vento. So that dispute would go through your district first. Ultimately, it could come to the state, but it would include who they can contact next to say they're appealing that choice, and then helping them through that process. And then while that process is going on, if they do dispute that decision, the student needs to be immediately enrolled in the school where they're seeking enrollment. So if it's staying in their school of origin, and that's where the dispute is, that student needs to continue attending their school of origin until the resolution of the dispute. I do see that someone asked, do we have any samples of a dispute process? We do have lots of samples on our district website. Sorry, our DPI website of forms that other districts use. And that was just linked in the chat for you. When remaining in the school of origin is not in the student's best interest, or it's not what the parent wants, or maybe it's just not possible because the student moved from very far away, or they moved from, somewhere in the middle of the state to the southern part of the state, and it's just not possible. Students experiencing homelessness are entitled to immediate enrollment in the local school that anyone else would attend where they're residing. And this includes even without required documents. So without records of immunization, any other health records, proof of residency, proof of guardianship, school records. We really want the student to be enrolled immediately, and then those things obtained after the fact. We want them in school. Enrollment means, I think Christina said this already, but it means attending classes and participating fully in school activities. So that really means getting them into school, helping them figure out what activities they might be interested in, and getting them active in school. And immediate means without delay. So sometimes I get questions of, is immediate 2 days? It means without delay. So really, it might depend a little bit if you're trying to place a high school student into classes and figure out, a class schedule that might take a day. It might take, if they come in an afternoon, it might take the whole next day to figure that out. But, an elementary student and our middle school student, hopefully, depending on kind of what's going on, should be enrolled quite immediate. I do see someone commented in the chat, what about students with complex needs, IEPs, concerns about starting immediately? So just some strategies with immediate enrollment. A district should not wait for an IEP. I do understand that there's concerns when there's complex needs. But sometimes getting a copy of an IEP, if it's someone coming from out of state in particular, or school records from out of state in particular, can take a long time, and we do not want students out of school for a week or more. Sometimes that is what I'm hearing from districts. So really thinking about maybe talking with someone from the school they were at previously, talking with the parent to find out what their understanding is, what they know. Really trying to get that information so you can make the best determination of getting a student enrolled immediately and participating immediately. But it's also okay to, if there's adjustments that need to be made once you do have a copy of that IEP. So again, just requesting those records, talk to the parent, talk to the youth if it's an older student, about the classes the student was in, what they had been working on, if they have any special needs, contacting that other school, maybe it's contacting the counselor or their teacher, just to ask some information about that while you may be waiting for records. A parent signature is not required for students. Again, we want to get them immediately enrolled. That's not required to have. Ensure enrollment staff are aware of McKinney Vento law and procedures and that students have these rights, because they might be pushing back on a family for like proof of residency or something like that that's delaying enrollment, when ultimately they don't have to have that right away. They need to be immediately enrolled first. So again, that goes back to kind of that training of all staff and finding out and making sure they know what questions to ask, so there aren't delays in that enrollment. And part of that as well kind of comes down to awarding and accepting partial credits, and provide credit recovery options for students. So there is a requirement in McKinney Vento to award partial credits. We do have recommendations for that were created by homeless liaisons from across the state. So really be thinking about if it's in the middle of a quarter, if it's at semester, looking at what partial credits can be awarded for students. I'm just looking at the chat.
I will bring back to Lindsay. Has a question. Is a determination letter required regardless of identification or not, or only if the student is not identified as experiencing homelessness?
You don't have to send a letter telling a family they have been identified. That would be probably more in conversation with the family as you're asking those questions to be able to make that determination. What they do need is they need to understand what their rights are for McKinney Vento and under McKinney Vento. So we have a lot of examples on our webpage as well, where I think the link was for dispute resolution examples of like a brochure that might be given to families. So they do need what their rights are under McKinney Vento, but it doesn't have to be like in any specific way or just a letter stating like you are identified.
It does need to be in a written format though. So for the rights under McKinney Vento, that part has to be written down for them in an understandable format. It doesn't not just verbally told to them, but it doesn't have to be in an identification letter or anything specific. There's a lot of questions coming in the chat. I don't know if we want to address those now or we can wait until later.
Mm-hmm. Jill asked, if a public charter school, does immediate enrollment apply to my school in the same way as it would a public school? Yes, because a public charter school is a public school. Yep. And then someone else asked, are we responsible for obtaining those records, including birth certificates that enrollment usually requires later on? I think I understand your question, and I would say yes, that would be a really great way to just kind of assist the family. So if a family doesn't have, for example, if a family doesn't have a birth certificate, they get enrolled. The school helps them obtain that birth certificate. You could keep that in files for if the family ends up losing housing again and transfers to a different district. That might be a way to more quickly get that student enrolled somewhere else. I would say it's not a requirement to keep a birth certificate on hand for a family, but that could be a conversation with that family. But really having other records available if another district requests them quickly. And in Wisconsin, we have a records requirement of 24 hours. So I just know a lot of times coming from out of state, it can be difficult to get those. Real quick, I want to address the question of, are students in foster care considered homeless? Because we probably don't say that anywhere today, because they are not considered homeless. There are different provisions for students in foster care, and in Wisconsin, it's a more umbrella term of in out of home care under the Every Student Succeeds Act. They have different provisions that they have rights to things that are kind of similar to McKinney Vento, but they are not identified as homeless. Okay. All right. There was a question about unaccompanied homeless youth, and we might answer that question with the next slide. So immediate enrollment for unaccompanied homeless youth still applies, even without a parent or guardian. McKinney Vento gives rights directly to unaccompanied youth. So they can enroll on their own. They can make their own educational decisions when they're enrolled in school. They can choose between their school of origin and their resident school where they're residing. I do recommend homeless liaisons, or in conjunction with school counselors, really talk to a student who is trying to decide between staying in their school of origin and enrolling where they're residing, especially if it's an older youth that's enrolling on their own, to be thinking about those like graduation requirements for both districts, just really sitting down and having a conversation so they understand that choice that they're making. And then they can also file disputes on their own as well if it gets to that point. So districts are still required to remove barriers to enrollment and attendance of unaccompanied homeless youth, and highly recommend using a caregiver form if appropriate, caregiver affidavit, caregiver form. It would be something that is not legally binding. It's not giving guardianship rights, but if a student is living with a caregiver, whether it's a family member, a family friend, any adult that might be kind of taking a little bit of responsibility for that student, then you could have them sign a caregiver form, which we do have a sample of a caregiver form on our webpage. But also just could be someone else the school contacts. That person could call the student in sick. But for older unaccompanied homeless youth, they can do all of that on their own. We also will talk more about unaccompanied homeless youth later today as well. Okay. Want to talk about coordination with other programs. This is not super in-depth, but really wanted to talk about kind of the big highlights of students who are identified under McKinney Vento are automatically eligible for free school meals. So that is a USDA policy that says liaisons can obtain free school meals for students immediately by providing the name of the student and the date that they were identified as experiencing homelessness. So you don't have to fill out a form. The families don't have to fill out the free and reduced price lunch form. It just can be an email from the liaison to the food service director, or whatever process you have in your district to ensure that that happens. And that can be taken as that automatic eligibility for free school meals. I have heard recently from a homeless liaison that sometimes, because they're the one person that can do it in their district, if they're out or if something happens and they can't get to it immediately that day, food service isn't, they might be missed a day. So food service is really going to take it from that day that they have that information. So I would say look at your district processes and procedures around that, and who's making that referral, or how that referral is kind of transferred to that food service director. Information about a student's living situation is a student education record, so it is protected under FERPA. So that means that within a school district, Not everybody should know that a student is experiencing homelessness. It should be on a need to know basis. So if there's a social worker or counselor in the school building, they probably have a need to know basis if they're interacting with the family and with the student more frequently, if they're helping a student apply to college and they need fees reduced or fees waived for things like that, those student services staff are probably on a need to know basis. All of a student's classroom teachers are not on a need to know basis. So really be thinking about your processes and procedures in your district to ensure that that status is protected within the district, and it's not something that every staff person has access to find out about a student. And then unaccompanied homeless youth must be informed of their status as independent students. Those who meet the definition of independent student can complete the FAFSA without their parental income information or signature. Okay, we already talked about extracurricular activities, so pretty quick here. Again, removing barriers for full participation. That might includes transportation, supplies that are needed, shoes, instruments, apparel to participate, and then those participation fees waived as well. McKinney Vento does require districts to review and revise district policies and procedures that may act as a barrier. So it's the responsibility of the homeless liaison to really review those policies and procedures. Specifically really looking at if there's barriers to identification and enrollment, attendance, academic success. And we highly recommend looking at your policies because if they have not been updated since 2016, they don't include the reauthorization under ESSA. And so those would definitely be policies to look at and update. Just some strategies for that. Again, looking at those existing policies and making recommendations. And then we highly recommend creating procedures within your district that are really go more in depth, look at identifying roles and responsibilities of different folks within your district related to students experiencing homelessness. It might include a walkthrough for identification, data entry, how referrals are made. Again, it can just elaborate more on sections of the policy, and procedures are a lot easier to update and maintain as staff and systems change within the district. All right, so really wanted to touch on data reporting as well briefly. So districts are required to ensure that students experiencing homelessness, the data on them, that identification is collected and submitted. So there does need to be a way for, there does need to be a system in place for tracking homeless students throughout the year. What that looks like for every district is going to be different. And students need to be entered into the district student information system. So Skyward, Infinite Campus, Power School. I know there's more. Those are the big ones that a lot of districts have in Wisconsin though. And they should be in that system with the homeless flag for that year. That's how that data is then communicated through DPI or communicated to DPI through the WISE data system and process. And that's how we at DPI collect information on students experiencing homelessness. So it's really important to have a process for who is entering that data into your SIS and how that's happening. Children and youth experiencing homelessness are also automatically eligible to receive Title I services. So this is going to be like a really brief touch on Title I eligibility, but it includes services that are provided for other school buildings that are receiving Title I funds. But the really important thing is that students experiencing homelessness are eligible to receive Title I services, even if they're not attending a Title I building in the district. And they're eligible to receive services for the remainder of the year in which they become permanently housed. So Services that are provided under Title I for students experiencing homelessness can look different. It could be academic supports, but it also could be a way to provide transportation, school supplies, mental health services, if that's what's needed for a student experiencing homelessness in a district. And then the way that students who are attending non-Title I buildings would receive those services is through the Title I Part A homeless reservation. The really big important thing to note here is that someone in your district is completing a Title I application. The homeless reservation is required for all school districts to take to be able to support their students experiencing homelessness. And the homeless liaison and either the business manager or the ESEA coordinator, whoever is completing that Title I application and budget, needs to be in communication with the homeless liaison to be able to determine that amount, because then that means there is a pot of funding, however big or small it may be, to be able to use to support your students experiencing homelessness in your district. A common use of the funds would be for the homeless liaison salary, paying for that transportation to and from the school of origin, for school fees, and then for like academic supports for students to be able to graduate. Okay. Questions that we didn't get to. I know Christina and Clara have been answering questions in the chat. I don't know if there's any that have really popped up that we should address, or if there's any that we missed.
Yeah, I would recommend that if we did not get to your question in the chat, or you think that you have some further details or want to elaborate, just raise your hand and we can unmute you.
I did see one that I'll mention while we see if others come in.
Mhm.
Caitlin asked, are we required to have legal guardian permission to add a different emergency contact for an unaccompanied youth in high school who is doubled up into our student data system?
That is a great question. So Christina, jump in with anything you have for this too, but districts are required to remove barriers for unaccompanied homeless youth. So if the student isn't old enough to call themselves in sick, or maybe there's some accountability that's needed with the student, and you need somebody to call them in sick, and you need that person to be in your student information system, that's a barrier that has to be removed for that student, and you can put them in your student information system. I think the important piece to be thinking about is if a parent or guardian is actively stating that they do not want someone to have access to educational records of their student or have educational decision making, then you would need to ensure that that caregiver, that other person you can contact, doesn't have access to like the student records or things like that. But they can still be in the system, because that's removing barriers for that unaccompanied homeless youth.
Just quickly,
I'd
somebody
agree.
mentioned that a couple of these slides might be missing from the deck that we posted, and you are probably correct. So I'm going to work on that right now to make sure that you have those couple slides in particular.
Okay.
There was one person with a hand raised. If you
Yeah. Sarah? You should be able to unmute. No, okay. Did anything change? Okay, sorry everybody. Sorry some mics aren't working. Okay, there's someone else. Libby, are you able to unmute?
I'm wondering, just, I don't, Sarah, I know you're running tech and you probably know what you're doing much more than me, but if you guys remember, sometimes when I would try to unmute during practice sessions, my option to unmute would be grayed out, but then Clara, somehow you, you could enable it. So I don't know if that's an issue.
Oh, I
Yep,
think mine just opened up.
There we go.
I
Okay.
did. Yep, I did just do that. So you should both be able to speak.
Okay. Is it okay if I go? This is Sarah. I had a question about families who are in the McKinney Vento program screened in because they're doubled up or because they're living in a home that is based on their employment, particularly around farm work. How we are finding that families are in these situations year after year. Oops, almost spilled my coffee. How do we, does that continue? Do they continue to qualify? At what point does it become fixed, regular, adequate? We have been continuing to qualify them year after year, but I know that at times that's been a question that I've been asked. And in those situations, families are not on the lease when they're doubled up, and they're not on the lease when they're working at the farm.
Christina, do we want to maybe wait till the eligibility conversation later?
We can. I can just provide like a light response maybe,
Sure.
and then we can go into more details. So it is within the realm of possibility that a living arrangement that you initially deem to be homeless, eventually you wouldn't continue to deem to be homeless if the living arrangement is fixed, regular, and adequate. So in cases where it's very stable, I probably would look at the adequacy piece. So it is feasible for a student to remain McKinney-Vento eligible for multiple years, but there are also instances where if it is fixed, regular, and adequate after the first, school year, you might change your determination at the beginning of the new school year. Jean, did you see the question from Anne about end dates? Do you want me to read it? End dates and student
Yep, I
date
just
system?
answered it in the chat. So you can put an end date of homelessness in your student information system, but it's not required because DPI and all of your student information systems communicate nightly. So we'll have that information once it's put in there. That's just kind of up to how your district procedure is. If you don't end date it, it will just be like they'll automatically end date it at the last day of school or the end of the year at the end of June.
Jean, and this is partially because different states maybe handle data differently, but the only thing you would want to make sure would not happen is if you somehow completely removed a student's designation as homeless to the point where it wouldn't be reported to DPI at all. Reason being, when the Department of Ed collects data on students experiencing homelessness, it is not just a point in time, like who was homeless on XYZ date during the school year, but the requirement is to report a student who has experienced homelessness at any point in the school year. So as long as you're able to do that, right, you just wouldn't want to completely remove that designation such that there'd be no way to report that student to DPI at all. Did I say anything that was contradictory? Yeah.
Nope. And I think you wouldn't like remove the homeless flag in your student information system. It would just be end dating. I do want to caution everyone that the student information system should not be carrying over identified students into the next year because they would need to be re-identified. But just be checking that at the beginning of the school year to make sure that's not happening. I do want to go back to, there was a question, what about the office staff that complete enrollment? They have to be privy to the knowledge that the student is homeless, right? I think that was going back to like FERPA and status. So there was a response from Clara that said, yes, registration and enrollment staff are crucial in identifying students, absolutely. So I think the kind of piece I want to point out with that is they are absolutely crucial in identifying students. They might make a referral to the homeless liaison to say like, okay, they didn't have paperwork. I think this family is experiencing homelessness, but they might not need to know that the official identification was made for a student or family. But it's going to depend on the processes within your district. If that enrollment staff is the person that's entering the information into your student information system, then yes, of course, they're going to know. But I think it's gonna depend on the processes you have. And then there's a couple of things in here about I think it's related to entering information into the student information system of someone that's not a parent or legal guardian. And maybe there's an issue with enrollment. Determining a household address when someone isn't able to do paperwork. So I know someone's got their hand raised. We'll get them to be able to unmute, but I think I'm not sure if that's the person they're staying with, or if it's their parent or legal guardian that's unwilling to do paperwork.
Christine, I can speak
Hi.
to that.
Thanks.
Hi. This is an unaccompanied homeless youth, a couple of them, actually, a couple of different families who are elementary school age. So their parents aren't reachable. We can't find them. So they're staying with adults who are caring for them. One's a 4K-er, another family has a 3rd grader, another one has a 4th grader. And part of the challenge is that the adults who are caring for them are willing to care for them, but not willing to do the caregiver or the educational guardianship paperwork for them. There's a variety of reasons for that, but our enrollment system then is saying that they can't enroll them because they don't have the rights to enroll them, and we can't put them in they won't put them in their own household so they can get enrolled because they're so young. So, and they're telling us that this isn't necessarily a district determination, it's a DPI determination of what they need to have in order to make sure that they have all their enrollment stuff in line. So it's a little bit of a challenge. You know, we do our work around, the kids are in school, they're learning, but we're still stuck with this enrollment piece that hasn't been resolved. And I'm just looking for some suggestions and ideas about how to make sure that we have all our T's crossed and our I's dotted.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thanks for that explanation. That helps me understand the question and the point. I don't know what DPI requirement they're referring to. I can definitely do some investigating within the agency around what that might look like. But ultimately, this sounds like a barrier to enrollment for an unaccompanied homeless youth. So the district's going to have to look at policies and procedures on removing those barriers for youth because they need to get enrolled. Christina, I don't know if you have suggestions from other states that maybe you've heard kind of running into something like this. I mean, ultimately, the student doesn't have to have a caregiver form filled out. They don't have, that's not a requirement. They don't have to have that information to get enrolled.
Yeah, I mean, I'll admit I can see why this would be sort of an angsty question for you. It is uncomfortable. I'll tell you what is clearly black and white, and then what's not and what you might consider. So, for better or worse, depending on the situation, federal statute and Department of Education guidance sometimes will say, here is what you must ensure happens, but how you ensure that happens is at your discretion. And this is one of those instances. So statute and guidance from the Department of Ed do say that immediate enrollment and full school participation must happen for students experiencing homelessness apart from a parent or guardian, so unaccompanied youth. But it doesn't say, and exactly how you handle paperwork is XYZ for every scenario, right? So this specific scenario is not addressed in any official capacity on you should do this, that, or the other. What I can tell you could happen and does sometimes happen in practice usually one of three enrollment methodologies or practices or strategies is used. So if the youth is old enough to enroll themselves, then the youth enrolls themselves and signs their own paperwork. If there is a caregiver willing to fulfill that role, then that person could fill out a caregiver affidavit and fulfill that and sign that paperwork. Some districts will allow or the local liaison to sign for enrollment, or I could foresee a world in which the district could develop, and I think something of this nature is up on the DPI website in terms of sample forms. So like a missing enrollment document, missing enrollment documentation affidavit. And you could state that there is no parent or guardian to enroll the student. Because of that, given the McKinney-Vento requirement for immediate enrollment, we are enrolling the student and have a school official or the local liaison sign for the student's enrollment. So that was a long answer. All of this to say, I can see why you would feel uncomfortable, but the enrollment does need to occur and really is in the best interest of the child. Perhaps use a missing enrollment affidavit and have someone at the school district indicate that you are proceeding with enrollment in keeping with the McKinney-Vento Act requirement. I don't know if that's helpful. That is how some other districts or states will do it.
Thank you. And we're working with Schoolhouse Connection to see if we can't get some policy procedures, legal language to help us move forward with that. But in the meantime, I still have these students who we are serving, but it just glitches. So thanks. Appreciate that.
Jenny. Okay. I don't see any more questions in the chat, but definitely feel free to keep those coming as we move through the day. Again, Clara said she updated the slides, so you should be able to refresh and get the most recent version of the slides. Just some resources for you. We'll talk about resources later as well, but our DPI webpage, Janie just mentioned Schoolhouse Connection. They're a really great national resource. The National Center for Homeless Education is the technical assistance center through the U.S. Department of Education. And then there's also the National Association for the Education of Homeless Children and Youth webpage. These are just some really specific resources for new homeless liaisons for you. There's a new resource from pretty new a couple weeks ago from Schoolhouse Connection about the essential tools and support for new homeless education liaisons. And then there's the Homeless Liaison Toolkit from the National Center for Homeless Education as well. And there's mine and Claire's contact information. We have that in lots of places, and hopefully you know how to contact us, and you can reach out at any time with questions.